Parashat Vayeshev begins our 4-week journey through the story of Yosef. Yosef's narrative is perhaps the most developed and detailed character arc outside of Moshe's, and it's one of growth, reconciliation, and redemption. And yet, in the very middle of our parasha, we confront the deeply problematic story of Judah and Tamar. For many of us, this is a challenging story. Why is it placed in the middle of the parasha? How are we supposed to feel about these characters? Is this story one that only evokes pain, or does it have something to teach us? So to recap, Yehuda, Yosef's older brother, leaves his family and marries a Canaanite. Together they have 3 sons, Er, Onan, and Shelah. Yehuda's oldest son, Er, marries Tamar. But God deems that Er is displeasing and takes his life. In accordance with a biblical law known as levirate marriage, Yehuda's next oldest son is obligated to marry Tamar. However, God quickly takes Onan's life as well. Tamar is now entitled to marry Shelah, but Yehuda casts Tamar away, leaving her in limbo. The practice being enacted here of yibum, or levirate marriage, dictated that a widow should marry the brother of her deceased husband if she did not yet have any children. On its face, deeply troubling, levirate marriage was a mechanism designed to preserve the name and legacy of a deceased husband. However, it could also be interpreted as an attempt to protect a woman from being alone in the event of losing a husband. That being said, rather than protecting Tamar, Yehuda blames her for the loss of his 2 sons. Later, after Yehuda has lost his own life, he encounters a veiled Tamar. Not recognizing her, he mistakes her for a sex worker. Tamar sees an opportunity. She agrees to sleep with Yehuda, her father-in-law, but requests that he leave his seal, his cord, and his staff as a pledge that he will eventually send a payment. When Yehuda's friend seeks her out to redeem his belongings, Tamar is nowhere to be found. 3 months later, Tamar reappears, visibly pregnant, and Yehuda is enraged, assuming that she has had a child outside of his family. Oblivious to his own hypocrisy, he calls for her death. As she's being brought out to her punishment, she reveals that she is having a child by the man who owns this seal, this cord, and this staff. In this moment, recognizing his belongings, Yehuda understands what has taken place. Tamar is pregnant with his child. He declares that Tamar is more in the right than he is himself, and she is not to be punished. The chapter concludes with a report that Tamar gives birth to twins, Peretz and Zerah. When learning this chapter with my teacher, Rabbi Dr. Amy Kalmanovsky, she asked me the following questions. As we look at this narrative, who looks good, who looks powerful, and whose interests are being served? And in my initial reading, my answer was something along the lines of, I'm not sure anyone looks good. Yehuda is holding all of the power in service of his own interests. However, an evaluation of this chapter in the context of the rest of the parasha, and if we zoom out even further in the context of the Tanakh at large, allows us to explore different answers to these questions. So while this narrative interrupts the Yosef story, it's actually also the very middle of Yehuda's own story. In the opening chapter of our parasha, Yehuda has just led the charge among his brothers in selling Yosef into slavery, thus making a profit off of him. Then in the opening verse of this chapter, the text is explicit in pointing out that Yehuda has left his family and married a Canaanite woman, violating an explicit prohibition from God not to do so. Over the course of Tamar's narrative, we witness how Yehuda continues to think of himself before anyone else in his family. However, if we look ahead a couple of weeks to Parashat Vayigash, we will witness the fullness of Yehuda's teshuvah and growth. When Yosef insists that Binyamin, their youngest brother, be left behind, Yehuda is persistent that it should be him that will stay back as a slave in place of his brother Binyamin. He's come full circle, concerned first and foremost with the needs of his aging father and his younger brother. So if we understand the ways that Yehuda will evolve, we can evaluate chapter 38 with a fresh set of eyes. In verse 1, Yehuda goes down to Canaan. Dr. Kalmanovsky asks, will Tamar play a role in lifting him up? At first glance, it appears that in donning a veil, Tamar, perhaps justifiably, deceives her father-in-law. However, maybe Tamar in fact wants to be seen. Not only does she speak to Yehuda directly, but she does so while standing at Petach Einaim, the entrance of Einaim, a phrase that literally means opening of the eyes. Tamar merely wants Yehuda to do right by her, to see her, but he is still too weak to understand how to take care of his own family. When Tamar presents Yehuda's belongings, forcing him to confront his actions, she does not do so in a way that exposes him or embarrasses him. Instead, Yehuda is able to recognize his belongings. This is the exact same language we read when Jacob also recognizes the tunic that Yehuda and his brothers have bloodied to deceive their father into believing that Yosef has been killed. This intertextuality, it's intentional, and it's here to demonstrate for us that Yehuda is finally recognizing his own sin and is in a position to take accountability. At this moment, Tamar looks good. Tamar looks powerful. She holds Yehuda accountable, but does so in a way that does not pit her interests against his, but rather serves both of their interests. Tamar's actions are further recognized as righteous and holy later on in the Tanakh in the book of Ruth. Ruth, another woman who takes her fate into her own hands by manipulating the rites of levirate marriage, gives birth to Obed, the grandfather of King David on his father's side. David's lineage on his mother's side traces all the way back to Peretz, the son of Tamar. In her commentary on the book of Ruth, the biblical scholar Irmtraud Fisher writes that two women, Naomi and Ruth, built up the house of David. The book of Ruth composes our people's history as women's history. In commenting on Tamar, Dr. Kalmanovsky argues that the story of Tamar can in fact be read as David's birth narrative, though admittedly several generations removed. Tamar's story is undoubtedly challenging. She is objectified, cast off, and nearly sentenced to death. However, she's also intentional and powerful. Her persistence is rewarded in the eyes of our tradition by linking her to arguably one of Tanakh's most central characters, King David. And furthermore, Tamar plays an important role why we, the Jewish people, the Yehudim, are named for Yehudah. When Yehuda is named by his mother Leah, she declares, Hapa'am odeh et Adonai. This time I will odeh, or praise Adonai. And thus, she names him Yehuda. Rabbi Shai Held reflects that despite being the unloved partner of Yaakov, Leah is still able to thank God. He writes, who is a Jew? One who discovers the possibility of gratitude, even amidst heartbreak. We are thus a people who are able to make space for the complexity and the contradictoriness of the human experience. And it's with this complexity in mind that I'd like to make a case for an addendum as to why we are named for Yehuda. The shorish at the heart of Yehuda's name, Yud Daled Hey, it's not only a word for offering gratitude or praise, it can also be translated as to confess one's sin. Chapter 38 is not just the middle of Yehuda's story, it's also the turning point. Tamar allows Yehuda the space to recognize his mistakes. And as a result, he's able to make different decisions moving forward. Where he once betrayed Yosef, he will come to selflessly sacrifice himself for his brother Binyamin. Where he was once only concerned with himself, he now understands what it means to put family first. As Yehudim, the complexity we hold is not only to find gratitude in moments of heartbreak, but it's also to allow people the chance to confess and to repent. So this Shabbat, may we be blessed not only to merit the sort of transformation undergone by Yehuda, but may we also be gracious enough to carry on the legacy of Tamar, allowing people the space and the opportunity to grow and change, even when it's painful. Shabbat Shalom.